Good morning, YouTube. All right, we are live on Instagram. We are live on YouTube. Hello, podcast listeners. My name is Dustin Jones, and you are listening to the PT on Ice Daily Show, brought to you by the Institute of Clinical Excellence. This is the MMOA segment. Every Wednesday, we talk about all things older adults, and today it's no different. We're going to be talking about how to build endurance in the clinic, or the home, or the hospital, or wherever you find yourself trying to help humans. We're going to talk about how to build endurance into those sessions, into those plans of care in a very efficient and effective manners. Before we get into the goods, I do want to mention MMOA is we've been rocking all year long. Our online cohorts, Essential Foundations and Advanced Concepts. We've been traveling across the country teaching live. We're wrapping up our online cohorts, and we're taking a little bit of a break in July to rest, recover, and revamp MMOA Essential Foundations. So this is where we kind of slow down, look at the latest research, update everything, and give you all the most up-to-date product that we possibly can. Our next cohorts, or next online cohort for Essential Foundations is going to be August 17th. And that's when we'll hit the road again with MMOA Live that weekend of August 13th and 14th. We'll have a couple courses going then. So go to ptonice.com. You can check out where we'll be in the near future. All right, building endurance in the clinic. Let's get into the goods. This is a very, I think, a difficult topic when we think about the context that many of us are working in terms of some constraints that you may have. I think everyone kind of feels this regardless of your setting, is that we do these assessments, right? You try and run people through several different outcome measures. You take a look at their life, some of their specific goals that are relevant to them and their desires and how they may perceive successful aging, what that looks like for them. We're baking all that stuff into our plan of care, right? And so at the end of that assessment, we kind of have this almost like a laundry list, right, of all these things that we could potentially work on, potentially improve to positively impact someone's life. Lots of opportunities, right? But with all those options and opportunities, that makes it difficult of which one we should really prioritize. If we think of triaging deficits, where do we start, right? Oftentimes in the context of older adults, one of the biggest factors that we're wanting to influence is strength. You've heard that a lot on this podcast, but the research is becoming very clear that stronger people are indeed harder to kill. Shout out to Mark Ripito. It's very true. The research is supporting that, and stronger people are typically more independent for a longer period of time, and they don't suffer as much from a lot of chronic disease and just some of the effects of kind of chronicity of morbidity, if you will. So we want to get people stronger, but then we also probably want to improve their balance. We definitely want to improve their endurance. Oftentimes, probably have some mobility deficits in some different areas. We got a lot to juggle and think about. So we don't want to prioritize one thing that would deem itself to neglect another, right? We don't want to prioritize strength, which would result in us neglecting endurance. we can do both, right? And then at the Institute of Clinical Excellence, you'll hear us say and not or. And this is a very pertinent concept for older adults because it's hardly ever an or situation. It's usually an and situation. We have to juggle all these different deficits. We want to see, can we influence them in a very significant manner across the board versus maybe just focusing on just one. So oftentimes, even though strength is going to be a priority, endurance is as well. And so we need to have that and not or approach. But the difficult part, right? We don't have a lot of time. You're only seeing people maybe once a week, maybe a couple times a week for a short period of time. How do we bake that in? How do we prioritize this into our sessions? So let's talk about some things, some very practical things that we want to think about when we're trying to have that and not or approach to build endurance in the clinic, when we're also trying to improve their strength, improve their balance, so on and so forth. So the first thing that we want to focus on is efficient programming and planning for our session. If you have spent any time around the Institute of Clinical Excellence, you've heard us mention these things like EMOMs and AMRAPs, rounds for times, right? This is very prevalent in the realm of CrossFit and a lot of fitness facilities where they will structure their workouts with a clock, with some of these things in mind. EMOM, for those that aren't familiar, stands for every minute on the minute. Every minute on the minute, you are going to perform X number of reps of an activity, or you're doing as many reps as you can in that particular minute, and then you typically switch between activities. AMRAPs means as many rounds as possible. You have a set period of time and you're working through a few different exercises more than likely, and trying to see how many times you can work through those activities in that given period of time. And then rounds for time is how quickly can you perform this amount of work that is laid in front of you. It may be 5 rounds of 3 different exercises, for example. But when we structure the workouts in that manner, what that does is puts a clock on it, right? It controls a lot of variables that we often don't control in the context of rehab. We're able to oftentimes control rest, right? How much rest people are having in between their activities, right? We're continuing the process of getting through a lot of these activities simply by having the clock. By controlling that rest, we also typically are going to increase intensity. It's going to make it more challenging. We're going to increase intensity, increase that overall cardiovascular demand, and they're going to end up getting that cardiovascular benefit. What you'll often see is we also make the sessions way more time efficient. The home healthers, you know this for sure. When you are not in a billing system that is based on time per se, you can really make your sessions super, super efficient, and that's very, very advantageous in the context of home health. But become way more time efficient, which oftentimes will allow you to do more stuff. You can focus on more things. You'll have a little more wiggle room and time for education and thinking about some of those lifestyle factors and helping people work through some of their barriers. It does a lot. That programming can make your session so much efficient and so much more effective, and often get that and not or benefit. You're going to get them stronger, but you're also going to improve their endurance as well. What I found is that before I started using, EMOMs and AMRAPs in practice, let's say I had 3x10 of like 3 exercises. That rest in between, in my mind, would only take, maybe 45 seconds to a minute. But in reality, what was happening is I was literally wasting 15 to 20 minutes a session on rest. And ultimately, that rest that would just bleed in throughout the session would lower the intensity and ultimately lower my ability to impact my folks. So efficient programming, EMOMs, AMRAPs, rounds for times, those types of things are going to be an absolute game changer. I highly recommend on the ptonnice.com website, there's a really helpful resource that Alex Germano made about EMOMs for the older adult. That's going to be very helpful and give you lots of examples of different types of folks. So that's the first one, efficient programming. Number 2 is we want to save zone 2 for the home. We want to save zone 2 for the home. Zone 2 is referring to when people are working at 60 to 70% of their max heart rate. This is very beneficial to do to build endurance, aerobic capacity, has a great benefit from the cardiovascular health standpoint. It is awesome. We definitely want to recommend that for sure. However, do we need to do that in the clinic, right? Do we need to accumulate kind of this moderate physical activity, which typically requires a longer period of time to get the benefits? Do we need to do that when we're with someone? Oftentimes what we'll see is that zone 2 is actually relatively easy for a lot of people to achieve. Adherence to that type of work is relatively higher than when we're pursuing higher intensity activities. And therefore, if we can shift that to the home when they're not being supervised, let that be the home exercise program. That's going to be a much better use of your time, especially in session when you are not trying to bake in that zone 2 work. So save zone 2 for the home. Don't do that in the session. I mean, if you have to, okay, but think about how you can shift that to some type of home exercise program. So efficient programming, AMRAPs, rounds for times, EMOMs, all that fun stuff. Save zone 2 for the home. And then last but not least, we need to redeem the new step. We need to redeem the new step or the recumbent bike or the treadmill or whatever you have in your particular space. Jeff Musgrave teaches with MMOA. He was calling the new step the warm-up machine. And if you think about our exposure to that piece of equipment across the board in all types of different settings, that's what it is, right? That it's a warm-up machine. It's a go grab your lunch machine. It's the finish that note machine or go use the bathroom machine, right? You throw people on there, they just do their thing. You don't have to coach them up at all. You go handle your business, whatever that is, right? And then we'll probably bill a unit or two for that. That's not a lot of skill, right? We want to turn those warm-up machines to actual fitness machines because they are rather potent pieces of equipment that we want to leverage, especially when you think about the space that they take up in your gym, in your clinic, and the cost of that piece of equipment. Many of us could likely be getting a whole lot more bang for our buck out of those pieces of equipment. So the new step, I know it has a lot of baggage, but I want y'all to think about the utility of this. And you may want to think about your recumbent bike or whatever you may have in your particular clinic, echo bike, assault bike, a rower, whatever. But a lot of these pieces of equipment, there's some advantages to them because one, they're familiar. Many of them, not all of them, right? Like a rower, many of the folks that I work with have not been on a rower. They have seen one before, but they haven't been on it. They've been on a bike, they've been on a new step, they've been on an elliptical, a treadmill. The familiarity of a piece of equipment is very advantageous to achieving a higher intensity. They're familiar with it, they're not afraid of it. Oftentimes they're controlling the motion, right? The range of motion, the degree of motion. It's familiar, it's comfortable. They know what they're getting into, and oftentimes that will open the door for them to be able to send it, to achieve those higher intensities, to do that true high intensity interval training in the session that's going to allow you to get some of those endurance benefits. So it's familiar. It's often tolerable as well. So some of these pieces of equipment with folks that may have pain on board, it's going to be tolerable to them. And oftentimes you can modify them to get that stimulus without irritating a particular joint, for example, especially some type of extremity issue. That's very advantageous, and you can get that endurance stimulus tolerable for a lot of individuals. So it's tolerable, it's familiar, and then one of the probably the most neglected aspects of these pieces of equipment, and probably the most valuable, is that it's objective. It's objective. Two parts to that. One, the value of the objectivity is that it gives you instant feedback, right? I can go on a rower or echo bike, assault bike, a new step, whatever, and I am looking at that screen and I know exactly how hard I'm working. I see that number. I may not understand those units, those calories per hour, the watts, whatever. Does that mean my 500-meter pace? I could have no clue what that means, but I'm getting instant feedback of how hard or how fast I'm working. Instant feedback. When I start to lower my effort, I see that number drop down. That is helpful. That's very helpful. If you combine that instant feedback with an intentional pursuit of dialing in their intensity, their dosage, you have a very potent cocktail. And I don't see a lot of folks doing this. We don't do a great job of prescribing the intensity of our activities, especially with interval training on these pieces of equipment. What if you gave people something to shoot for, like a particular 500-meter pace on the rower, or a particular calories per hour on the rower, or let's say revolutions per minute on the bike, right? Or wattage on the new step. What if you gave them an objective mark to hopefully be able to maintain during your interval training that was ultimately based on a percentage of their max capacity? That is rather potent. That makes endurance training much more efficient because they're going to spend a lot of their time in those beneficial zones or intensities, if you will. Now, you will see all kinds of different ways to kind of measure or track someone's max capacity on a lot of these pieces of equipment. A very popular one is the incremental ergometer test that you will typically see on a cycle ergometer, but there's also a new step method as well. And this is just a method to kind of see what's people's peak power output. And I think this is an interesting concept that we can put to different units, right? To be able to establish a max and then work off of a percentage. So that peak power output based on that cycle ergometer test, you basically try and increase their work by 10 watts per minute, and they're maintaining a certain cadence. So on the new step, it's usually between 80 to 100 steps per minute. You're increasing the resistance and you're trying to increase their power output by 10 watts per minute. And whatever they're able to maintain for 30 seconds before they tap out is considered their max, their peak power output. And then you can go back to working off of percentages. And based on a lot of the recommendations for aerobic training, think of the ACSM recommended guidelines. We have that moderate and vigorous intensity of activity. Moderate is considered to be 50 to 70% of their peak output. And then vigorous is going to be 70 to 90%. of that vigorous output. So you could establish someone's peak power output and establish, say, hey, we need to at least reach, 70% of that number, whatever that is. And you're going to ensure that you're going to reach a vigorous intensity, which we know is ultimately more beneficial and takes less time. We could also do this with our 500-meter pace, right? How fast can you row 500 meters? What is that pace? Work off of percentage of that. You can take these units and use that same concept to try and get a little bit more objective about dosing your intensity. And we can use this with all these different pieces of equipment that's going to make your session way, way more efficient, and not just leave it up to them to determine if they're working hard enough. You can show them. You can make it very, very clear. All right. Let me know your thoughts. Building endurance in the clinic. I think we can do a lot more here. A lot of things that we can control, a lot of things that we can improve to make things more efficient. We can be efficient with our programming, AMRAPs, round for times, EMOMs, save that zone 2 for the home. Think about redeeming the new step or whatever piece of equipment or erg, if you will, that you have in your clinic, and think about how you can use that to maybe be a little more objective to be able to dial in that intensity. We can do it, y'all, and not or. We can get people stronger. We can improve their endurance as well. Y'all have a lovely rest of your Wednesday. I will talk to y'all soon. Take care. Also, Hump Day Hustle. I forgot to mention that Wednesday just came out. I'm excited to check that out. Jeff Moore just sent that. If you don't get that email, ptonice.com, Hump Day Hustle. See y'all.